with juvenile grizzlies possessing strength far beyond that of an average adult human. One can only imagine the sheer force of a fully grown bear. But why are they so powerful? This question arises time and again after every brutal attack they unleash, as seen in the tragic fate of 3 officers in 2025. Join us as we recount the harrowing events that befell them. The wind howled through the towering pines of the wilderness of Alaska, carrying with it the sharp bite of midwinter cold. Snow blanketed the vast wilderness, stretching endlessly in every direction, broken only by the skeletal remains of bare branches and the jagged peaks looming in the distance. The land was silent, but for the occasional rustling of unseen creatures, their movements hidden beneath the heavy weight of the season. It was in this unforgiving expanse that 3 Alaska State Police officers, Sergeant Rachel Adams, Officer Thomas Davis, and Officer Jessica Lee, found themselves on February 10th, 2025. The trio had been assigned to patrol the area after reports of an increase in bear activity. Sightings had become more frequent, with some locals claiming that an aggressive grizzly had been roaming too close to human settlements. In the bitter cold, food was scarce, and a starving bear was a dangerous one. Though the officers carried rifles for protection, their primary objective was investigation. They were looking for tracks, signs of hunters operating outside legal limits, and any indication that a bear had ventured too far beyond its natural hunting grounds. Their patrol vehicle sat parked just off a narrow, icy road nestled between the trees. It had been left there as they ventured deeper into the woods, following a set of tracks that could have belonged to either a poacher or an animal. The officers, bundled in thick winter gear, moved cautiously, each step crunching softly in the snow. What they did not know was that while they were following their trail, something found them. A grizzly, its ribs pressing against its thick hide, had picked up the scent of food. The officers had brought snacks, protein bars, some leftover sandwiches, nothing substantial, but enough to attract a starving animal. The bear, driven by hunger, followed the scent, its massive paws pressing deep into the snow. It had no fear of humans. In fact, it had encountered them before. It had learned that food could be found in their presence, though it had never been bold enough to approach directly. Until now. By the time Rachel, Thomas, and Jessica returned to their vehicle, the bear was already inside. The windows had been shattered, the door bent outward from the sheer force of the animal's weight. The inside was in ruins, wrappers shredded, seats torn apart. The scent of food was replaced by the thick, musky odor of wet fur and raw desperation. Then the snow moved. A blur of muscle and rage lunged from the wreckage. Before any of them could react, the bear was on Officer Thomas. A sickening crack split the air as the bear's weight drove him down, its massive jaws clamping onto his shoulder. He barely had time to cry out before he was wrenched backward, his body dragged through the snow as his boots kicked helplessly. His rifle, slung across his chest, was trapped beneath him, useless as the bear yanked him toward the trees. Rachel and Jessica barely had time to process what had happened before instinct took over. Their hands went for their weapons, but panic made everything slower. Rachel fumbled with the strap of her rifle, her gloves stiff from the cold. Jessica managed to unholster her sidearm, raising it just as the bear let out a deep guttural roar, one that vibrated in the very marrow of their bones. Thomas was still alive, but barely. His face was twisted in agony, blood staining the pristine snow beneath him. The bear's claws raked down his side, tearing through his thick jacket as though it were paper. His breaths came in short gasps, his body convulsing as he fought against the inevitable. Rachel fired first. The shot rang out across the empty wilderness, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the vastness of the land. The bullet struck the bear's side, but it barely seemed to notice. Adrenaline and hunger drove it forward. It released Thomas, turning on Rachel now, charging with terrifying speed. She tried to fire again, but the bear was too fast. It barreled into her, knocking the rifle from her grasp, sending her sprawling onto the ice-hard ground. Claws raked across her leg, shredding fabric and flesh alike. Pain exploded through her body, but she had no time to react before the bear's massive jaws snapped inches from her face. Jessica fired repeatedly, her shots slamming into the bear's thick hide, but they did nothing to slow it down. It turned its fury on her next, the sheer weight of its body that sent her skidding across the ice. Her skull cracked against a rock, her vision darkening at the edges as the world tilted. Blood trickled down her face, hot against the freezing air. Rachel, still conscious, tried to crawl toward her rifle. Her fingers brushed against the metal, but before she could grab it, the bear's weight crushed down on her. A deafening roar filled the air, a primal, earth-shaking sound that drowned out even the howling wind. She felt the unbearable pressure of its jaws closing around her torso, her ribs snapping like dry twigs. Her vision blurred, the edges darkening as her strength left her. Jessica's attempts to fight back were futile. The bear was relentless, its hunger driving it beyond pain, beyond hesitation. It tore into her, her struggles weakening until she was still. When the bear finally lifted its head, steam rose from its fur. It looked at the carnage, its breathing heavy, muscles trembling from exertion. The bodies lay still, with the only movement coming from the slow spread of blood soaking into the snow. Then, as if nothing had happened, the bear turned and disappeared into the trees. Days later, search teams arrived, following the signal from the officer's last known location. What they found was devastation. The vehicle, destroyed. The snow, stained with congealed blood. The officers' bodies, mauled beyond recognition. News of the attack sent shockwaves through the community. These were experienced officers, trained to handle the dangers of the wild, yet they had been caught off guard by the ruthless efficiency of nature's oldest predator. The bear was identified as the same one wildlife officials had tracked earlier in the year, a known aggressive individual that had eluded capture multiple times. Efforts were made to hunt it down, but by the time authorities mobilized, the grizzly vanished deep into the mountains. Search parties combed the forests for days, but the beast had returned to the wilderness, leaving behind nothing but the memory of what it had done. The Alaskan wilderness stretched endlessly, vast, untamed, and indifferent. Towering peaks loomed in the distance, their jagged edges cutting into the sky. Dense forests sprawled below, their thick canopies swallowing the light. It was a place of beauty, but also of danger, where survival was never guaranteed, and Mark Davis understood that. At 34, he was an experienced hiker, comfortable with solitude and the demands of the wild. He had spent months planning this trek, meticulously mapping his route and packing supplies. A week alone in the backcountry was nothing new to him, just another test of endurance, another chance to lose himself in the quiet vastness of nature. In early August 2023, he set out with confidence. His pack was secured, his steps steady. The first few days passed in a rhythmic blur, with the crunch of boots on soil, the crisp scent of pine in the air, and the distant cry of an eagle soaring overhead. He moved through valleys, climbed ridges, and let the isolation sink into his bones. The wilderness was his to navigate, and he relished it. By the fifth day, fatigue had begun to settle in. His legs ached, his food supply had grown monotonous, and his body craved rest. He found a quiet spot near a river, the steady rush of water a soothing backdrop as he set up camp. The fire crackled, fending off the night's chill. He ate, stretched out beneath the stars, and drifted into sleep, unaware that something had been watching him. The grizzly had been in the area for days, moving silently through the undergrowth, its hunger sharpening with each passing moment. Food had grown scarce for the bear, forcing it to take risks. It had caught Mark's scent hours ago, and now, in the dead stillness before dawn, it made its move. The attack came with terrifying speed. One moment the forest was quiet. The next, a force of pure muscle and fury exploded from the trees. Heavy paws tore through the brush, closing the distance between predator and prey in seconds. Mark jolted awake, but there was no time to react. The bear's massive weight slammed into him, knocking the air from his lungs. Claws raked across his side, slicing through fabric and skin like paper. The pain was instant, blinding, but there was no time to process it. The grizzly's jaws found his shoulder, teeth sinking deep, crushing muscle and bone with terrifying ease. Panic drowned out the pain. Mark kicked wildly, his boot slamming into the bear's thick hide, but it did nothing. Its sheer power was overwhelming. It lifted him effortlessly, dragging him away from his camp, away from the fire, deeper into the woods. The ground scraped against his back as he fought, his fingers clawing at the ground, grasping for anything to stop the inevitable. But the bear was relentless. It did not hesitate, did not pause. This was not a warning, not a defensive swipe. This was a hunt. Mark was prey. His screams were swallowed by the vast emptiness of the wilderness, lost in the indifference of the land that had once felt so familiar. And then, silence. Days passed before anyone realized he was missing. Mark had told few people of his plans. He had always preferred solitude, trusting his own skills over the company of others. But when he failed to return, search teams were sent into the backcountry, their voices calling his name, their eyes scanning the endless expanse of forest. At first, they found only remnants: a torn tent, his gear scattered, claw marks gouged deep into the dirt. Then, they saw the tracks. Massive prints leading away from the campsite, dragging impressions in the soil hinting at what had happened. The realization was grim. For weeks, they scoured the wilderness, hoping for a sign, a miracle. But the forest had already decided his fate. The grizzly had done what it was meant to do: survive. Deep in its territory, beneath layers of leaves and dirt, it had hidden its kill. What it could not eat immediately, the bear buried, protecting its prize from scavengers. It wasn't until wildlife officials tracked the bear down and euthanized it that the truth was confirmed. The final pieces of Mark's story were found inside the beast's stomach, a brutal, undeniable end. News of the attack sent waves through the hiking community. Cautionary warnings resurfaced, reminding adventurers of the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. But those who understood the wilderness knew this was no anomaly. The wilderness had always been dangerous. Grizzlies had always ruled these forests. Mark had been skilled, careful, but in the end, it hadn't mattered. The Mountain View Wildlife Park had long been a favorite attraction for nature enthusiasts. Nestled in the rolling hills of California, it offered visitors a rare chance to see some of the world's most magnificent animals up close. But for all the precautions taken, the animals remained what they were: powerful, unpredictable, and utterly untamed. On March 3rd, 2023, Karen Ellis arrived at the park with eager anticipation. At 29, she was an avid traveler and photographer, always seeking out moments of raw beauty. The special event that day had drawn a small crowd, an exclusive tour which was allowing visitors a closer look at the park's most impressive animals. For Karen, it was the perfect opportunity to capture something extraordinary. The brown bear enclosure was one of the park's main attractions. The bear, a massive male that weighed over 900 pounds, had been in captivity for years. Though accustomed to human presence, the bear remained a force of nature, his strength evident in every movement. The steel bars of his enclosure were thick, reinforced by additional fencing to prevent any chance of escape. As the group gathered near the bear's habitat, Karen felt the familiar rush of excitement. Camera in hand, she maneuvered closer, angling for the perfect shot. The bear was pacing, restless, his thick fur rippling with every step. Whether it was the crowd's presence, the noise, or something deeper, some primal irritation, his agitation was palpable. Ignoring the warning signs, Karen leaned in. The fence separating her from the bear was meant to provide a buffer, a safe distance for observation. But the need for a closer view, a better angle, overrode her caution. She stretched forward, her camera lens extending just beyond the designated boundary. The bear moved faster than anyone expected. In a flash, a massive paw shot through the bars. Claws like curved daggers hooked into Karen's arm, sinking deep into flesh. A terrible force yanked her forward, slamming her against the metal fence. The air left her lungs in a choked gasp as pain erupted through her body. Its weight was overwhelming, her arm locked in an iron vise. She struggled, feet scrambling against the ground, but the bear was relentless. His powerful muscles flexed as he pulled again, his claws raking down her torso, tearing through fabric and skin. A desperate surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins as she fought to wrench herself free. Her body twisted violently, pain radiating from every wound. The jagged edges of the fence scraped against her as she thrashed. Blood seeped down her arm, dripping onto the concrete below. The bear's breath was hot, the scent of raw earth and musk filling her senses. All around her, chaos erupted. People shouted, hands grabbed at her, trying to pull her back. A sharp, sudden crack split the air, a tranquilizer dart fired by zoo staff. The bear snarled, the sound deep and guttural, but his grip loosened. His head shook, his muscles tensing before the sedative took hold. Freed from his grasp, Karen collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling, the world spinning around her. Pain was everywhere, a burning, throbbing presence in her arm and her side. Blood soaked her clothing, her skin torn and raw. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, the shock dulling the full extent of her injuries. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their hands firm yet careful as they assessed the damage. Her arm, nearly shredded, bore deep gashes where the bear's claws had sunk in. Her broken bones jutted beneath bruised skin. The wounds along her torso were severe, but her arm posed the greatest danger. Torn tendons, exposed muscle, a wound that would take months, perhaps years, to fully recover from. The ride to the hospital was a blur, a mix of flashing lights and urgent voices. Painkillers dulled the worst of it, but the memory of the attack lingered sharp, replaying in her mind with brutal clarity. The sheer power of the bear, the helplessness of being trapped in its grasp, the terrifying realization that she had been moments away from something far worse. It lingered, settling deep in her bones. Surgery was inevitable. The damage to her arm required extensive reconstruction. Doctors worked to repair torn tissue, to set the broken bones, to ensure that function, however limited, could be restored. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological scars were just as deep. The attack had been brief, yet it had changed everything. In the days that followed, the incident dominated headlines. Questions arose about zoo safety, about the precautions taken, or lack thereof, that had allowed such an attack to happen. The park faced scrutiny, its protocols examined and criticized. Changes were inevitable, and barriers were reinforced. Signage made more explicit, visitor policies adjusted to prevent another near tragedy. For Karen, recovery was slow. The physical pain was one thing, but the mental weight of the experience was something else entirely. The fear lingered, creeping into her dreams, manifesting in sudden, involuntary flinches whenever she recalled the bear's sheer force. She had survived, but survival came with its own challenges. The wild animals, even in captivity, were not meant to be tamed. The bear had acted on instinct, responding to a moment of perceived intrusion. It was a stark reminder that no matter the setting, no matter the barriers put in place, nature remained untouchable, uncontrollable. The scars on her body would heal in time. The deeper wounds, the ones hidden beneath the surface, would take longer. But one thing was certain: Karen Ellis would never forget the moment she came face to face with the raw, unrelenting power of the wild. The cold bit deep in Yagodnoy that evening, the wind carving through the narrow streets like a blade. February had been relentless, the kind of winter that tested even those accustomed to hardship. Snow piled against the squat buildings, pressing against doors and windows, muffling sound. The village, though small, was not lifeless. Light still glowed in a handful of windows, the warmth within a stark contrast to the icy stillness outside. At the center of town, Alina Morozova was finishing up for the night. The beauty salon, her small sanctuary, had been a labor of love for years. Though clients were few in a place like this, she had built a modest business tending to the needs of the women in the village, offering haircuts, facials, and on occasion manicures. The space smelled of shampoo and lotions, their scents delicate against the sharper scent of acetone and hair dye. She moved with the practiced ease of routine, sweeping up stray hair, wiping down mirrors, putting tools in their proper places. Outside, the wilderness pressed in. The forest had always been there, sprawling beyond the edge of the village, its presence a constant fact of life. The people of Yagodnoye knew its ways and understood the rhythms of the land. But the rules of nature had begun to change. That winter had been harsher than most, and food was scarce for the creatures that lurked in the trees. There had been whispers of bold wolves venturing closer, their eyes flickering in the dark just beyond the reach of streetlights. And the bears, some had woken early, restless and hungry, the unnatural thaw followed by another freeze, confusing their instincts. Alina had heard the stories but thought little of them. She had lived here all her life, knew these dangers in an abstract way, the same way she knew the ice on the river could be treacherous in early spring. She locked up the register, stretched her aching back, and reached for her coat. It was late. The street outside was silent. Then came the sound, deep, guttural, and close. The bear had been watching. It had smelled the traces of food, the faint perfume of skin creams and something else, something unfamiliar but enticing. It had followed the scent through the village, the bear's massive paws crunching over frost-bitten snow, breath steaming in the frigid air. It was not like the usual village bears, the ones that rummaged through trash or snatched fish from the river. This one was desperate, its ribs pressed against its thick fur, hunger gnawing at it with an urgency it could no longer ignore. The door was flimsy against its weight. A single powerful shove and the lock gave way, splinters scattering across the floor. The crash shattered the stillness, sending bottles toppling from shelves and a mirror cracking in protest. Alina froze, her breath catching in her throat. Panic hit first, raw and immediate. The bear stood in the doorway, massive, dark, its fur bristling with frost. Its breath came in heavy puffs, and its small eyes gleamed with a feverish hunger. Alina stumbled back, her mind racing, searching for an escape. The only exit was past the bear. The bear moved with terrifying speed, its claws skidding across the tile. Alina bolted toward the back room, her heartbeat slamming against her ribs. Shelves crashed behind her, the bear swiping at anything in its path, sending a cloud of shattered glass and plastic into the air. The scent of chemicals mixed with the sharp tang of fear. The back room was small, cluttered with supplies. Alina shoved against a cabinet, trying to wedge it between herself and the bear. It wasn't enough. The bear surged forward, its bulk knocking over the obstacle as if it were nothing. Its weight alone filled the room, its sheer presence suffocating. Then came the pain. The bear's first blow sent her sprawling. Claws like knives tore through fabric and skin, a sudden burst of agony that stole her breath. The world tilted, her vision blurring. Another swipe, this one worse. Hot blood spattered against the walls, soaking into discarded towels, darkening the floor. Instinct fought against inevitability. She kicked, struggled, tried to push herself away. A bottle of acetone tumbled from a shelf, the sharp scent burning the air. The bear ignored it, focused solely on the prey before it. The struggle was brief, violent. The bear's weight pinned her down, its breath hot against her skin. Teeth found purchase. Flesh tore. The salon, once so lovingly tended, became a scene of chaos and horror. The warm glow of the lamps cast long, grotesque shadows over the wreckage. Outside, the noise had not gone unnoticed. A neighbor, hearing the crash, had stepped onto his or her porch, squinting into the darkness. The sounds that followed, crashing, a scream that cut off too soon, the unmistakable growl of a predator, sent a surge of alarm through the quiet village. People came running. A shotgun was fetched. But by the time the villagers reached the salon, it was too late. The bear, frenzied by the kill, turned on them. A shot rang out, shattering the night. The creature flinched but did not fall. It retreated, crashing through the broken door, vanishing into the snow-laden streets. What remained inside was a grim scene. The beauty salon, once a place of careful grooming and quiet conversation, was unrecognizable. Blood streaked the walls, pooling on the floor in dark, glistening swathes. Alina lay where she had fallen, her body torn and lifeless, her face frozen in a final expression of terror. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood. The village moved quickly. A hunting party formed, tracking the bear's path through the snow, following the deep impressions of its massive paws. The animal had not gone far. Wounded, exhausted, it had taken refuge near the edge of the forest, where the trees stood silent and waiting. The second shot found its mark. The bear crumpled, the last breath leaving its massive chest in a slow, shuddering exhale. The great beast, once a force of nature, lay still, its fur matted with ice and blood. The villagers stood over it in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on them. By morning, the news had spread. The headlines painted the picture in stark, chilling words. A salon owner, brutally killed. A bear, tracked and put down. A village left rattled, reminded in the harshest terms that the wild was never far, that hunger could drive even the most powerful creatures into desperate, deadly acts. The beauty salon would never reopen. The building stood empty for months, becoming a silent monument to that terrible night. The people of Yagodnoye carried on, as they always did, but something had changed. Doors were locked earlier. Shadows were watched more carefully. And in the cold, unrelenting dark of winter, the forest felt closer than ever. The air was still on the night of March 12th, 2022, the kind of silence that only the deep wilderness could offer. No roads, no distant hum of civilization, only the rhythmic lapping of the lake against the shore and the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. The world here belonged to the wild. Eric Daniels and his companions had set up camp in a secluded valley on Kodiak Island, a place where nature remained untouched, and the vastness of Alaska stretched endlessly in every direction. They had spent the day hiking along the ridgeline, their boots crunching over thawing earth as they marveled at the raw beauty of their surroundings. Towering evergreens, jagged peaks still capped in snow, the dark blue expanse of the lake reflecting the sky like a mirror. The trip had been everything they had hoped for, an escape from the modern world, a chance to test themselves against the wild, to breathe air that felt cleaner, sharper, untouched by human hands. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, temperatures plummeted. They had built a fire, its glow flickering against their tents, sending long shadows stretching across the frost-covered ground. The day's exertion left them exhausted, muscles aching in a satisfying way, and one by one they retreated into their tents. The fire burned low, crackling quietly as it fought against the cold. then died down to glowing embers. Beyond the reach of the campsite, something moved. The Kodiak bear had emerged from the forest hours earlier, its massive frame blending with the darkness, nostrils flaring as it followed the scent of food and human presence. The winter had been long, and the struggle for survival brutal. Hunger gnawed at its insides, an emptiness that could no longer be ignored. The bear had been roaming the edges of the valley, drawn in by the smell of smoked fish, the remnants of a meal that had been cooked too close to the tents. Instinct guided it. Food was near. The humans, nothing more than obstacles in its path, had unknowingly laid an invitation. The first sign of its presence was the crunch of heavy paws against frozen earth. The bear moved slowly, methodically, circling the camp. It stood on the outskirts, watching. The tents were fragile things, fabric stretched thin, the human sense within clear and distinct. It tested the air again, eyes gleaming in the faint moonlight, and then it stepped forward, silent despite its size, massive muscles shifting beneath thick fur. The bear chose a tent at random. Eric never had the chance to wake fully. The canvas tore apart in an explosion of claws and force, nylon ripping like paper as the bear lunged inside. One swipe sent him tumbling, blankets and sleeping bags tangling around him, his mind still struggling to wake. Then came the teeth, clamping onto his shoulder, crushing muscle and bone in a single devastating bite. The pain was instant, searing, and white-hot. He screamed, a sound so raw and filled with terror that it shattered the stillness of the night, sending his companions scrambling from their tents in a frantic blur. The bear dragged him out into the open, its immense strength rendering his struggles meaningless. He thrashed, kicked, tried to claw his way free, but it was useless. The weight of the beast pinned him down, its breath hot and reeking of decay. Another bite, deeper this time, tore through his side. He felt it. Felt the unbearable crush of pressure, the tearing of flesh, the sickening crunch of his ribs giving way. His friends were yelling, their flashlights cutting jagged beams through the darkness, but the bear showed no signs of relenting. It shook him, ragdolling his body as if testing its kill, then released him just long enough to reposition its grip. Blood pooled beneath him, steaming against the cold ground. His vision blurred, the world narrowing to nothing but pain and the immense, overpowering presence of the predator above him. One of his friends threw a rock through the air, striking the bear's flank. Another followed. The beast turned, momentarily distracted. Someone had grabbed a flare, the sudden burst of red light casting everything into a surreal, nightmarish glow. For a second, the bear hesitated, muscles coiled, nostrils flaring as it assessed the threat. Then, with a grunt, it backed away, its great bulk shifting into the shadows, disappearing into the tree line as quickly as it had come. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged breaths of those left standing. By the time they reached Eric, he was unrecognizable. His body lay twisted in the dirt, his clothes soaked in blood, and skin torn where claws and teeth had left their mark. He was still alive then, barely. Each breath came shallow, gurgling, his chest rising in weak, uneven movements. One of his friends pressed their hands against his wounds, trying to stop the inevitable. But it was too much, too deep, too brutal. His eyes, wide with shock, fluttered briefly, then closed. He did not open them again. The reality of the wilderness hit them hard in that moment. This place, so breathtaking in its beauty, was just as ruthless as it was majestic. The line between life and death was thin out here, and Eric had crossed it in an instant. The group moved quickly after that. One of them triggered the emergency beacon, their hands still slick with blood as they punched in the distress signal. They sat in silence, wrapped in blankets, huddled around the still-burning flare as they waited for help. The cold pressed down, the wind howled through the trees, and somewhere, beyond the reach of their light, the bear still lurked. When the search and rescue team arrived, dawn had barely begun to touch the sky. The body was taken first, wrapped carefully, reverently, though nothing could hide the horror of what had been done. A decision was made. The bear had to be found. It did not take long. The blood trail led deep into the forest, through dense thickets and frozen streams, winding toward a rocky outcrop where the creature had taken refuge. The men who followed that trail moved with purpose, rifles raised, their faces grim beneath the weight of their task. The bear did not run. It stood its ground, powerful even in its final moments, blood still staining its muzzle. There was no hesitation in the shot that followed. A single crack of gunfire, then another, and the great beast crumpled. The valley around them grew quiet again. Eric's death became a warning, whispered among those who ventured into the depths of the Alaskan wilderness. The mountains, the forests, the lakes. They did not belong to humanity. The people who lived by them, who passed through them, who sought their solitude and their beauty, did so only at the mercy of the creatures that ruled there. The campsite where Eric had stayed was abandoned after that. The tents were taken down, the fire pit buried beneath a fresh layer of earth, the ground wiped clean of everything except the memory of what had happened. But the wilderness remembered. The wind carried the echoes of his last moments. The trees stood witness. And the lake, so calm, so deceptively peaceful, would forever hold the story of the man who had come seeking adventure, only to become part of the wilderness itself. The early spring air in western Montana carried the damp, earthy scent of thawing soil, mingled with the sharp tang of pine. Winter had finally loosened its grip, leaving behind patches of stubborn snow nestled in the forest's hollows. The trees, tall and solemn, stretched skyward, their bare branches beginning to bud with the first signs of new life. It was the kind of crisp, bright afternoon that Jack and Mary Thompson cherished, the kind that made them feel eager to lace up their boots and disappear into the woods. For decades, the couple had roamed these forests, their bond with the land as enduring as their marriage. They had spent countless afternoons foraging, identifying edible plants, and reveling in the quiet that only deep wilderness could offer. Mushroom hunting had become a favorite pastime, a gentle yet rewarding pursuit that kept their senses sharp and their spirits youthful. That afternoon, March 25th, 2024, seemed no different from the hundreds of others before it. Jack had packed his favorite knife, the one with the worn wooden handle, while Mary carried a small wicker basket, eager to collect the first morels of the season. Their steps were slow but steady as they moved along the familiar trail, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The forest felt alive with possibility. Birds flitted between the branches, their calls crisp in the still air. The distant sound of a creek bubbling over smooth stones provided a rhythmic backdrop to their search. They had always known the risks of venturing into bear country, but in all their years of exploring, they had never felt threatened. What they didn't realize was that they were walking toward danger. Just ahead, beyond the thick underbrush, the grizzly bear was feeding. The powerful creature had emerged early from hibernation, its body still lean from the long winter, its hunger sharpening its instincts. It had found a deer carcass, half buried in leaves and snow, a precious meal in a time when food was scarce. Every sense was attuned to the protection of its claim, every nerve ready to defend against intruders. The Thompsons, unknowingly closing the distance, gave no indication of stopping. Jack spotted a promising patch of mushrooms near the edge of a small clearing and stepped forward to take a closer look. Mary, a few paces behind, adjusted her basket. Neither of them saw the shape in the brush, the rise and fall of massive shoulders, the flicker of movement that indicated something primal and powerful stirred. Then came the charge. The stillness was shattered in an instant. A blur of muscle and fur erupted from the undergrowth, and the ground trembled beneath the force of the oncoming beast. Jack barely had time to register the danger before the bear was upon them, a wall of raw power moving with terrifying speed. Instinct took over reason. Jack pivoted toward Mary, his only thought to shield her. His arms went up, but the bear was faster. A massive paw swiped through the air, claws slicing into his leg like razors. Pain exploded up his side as he collapsed, the ground rushing to meet him. The force of the blow sent him rolling, his breath knocked from his lungs. Mary screamed, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to escape. The bear turned its attention to her, eyes wild with adrenaline, breathing in hot, ragged bursts. It lunged, knocking her off balance, its weight crushing down as she hit the ground hard. Claws raked across her shoulder, tearing through fabric and flesh. The shock of it sent fire through her nerves, her vision blurring with agony. The struggle was desperate, chaotic. Jack, half conscious, tried to push himself up, but his leg refused to support him. Blood seeped into the dirt beneath him, his heart pounding so violently he could hear it in his ears. He forced himself forward, dragging himself through the undergrowth. Mary writhed beneath the bear's grip, her hands flailing against its thick fur, its breath smothering her as it snarled, jaws snapping too close to her face. Then a sound, something sharp and foreign. A gunshot cracked through the trees. The bear recoiled, muscles tensing, head snapping toward the direction of the noise. Another shot followed, not a hit but a warning. The animal hesitated, nostrils flaring, weighing the sudden shift in its surroundings. Then with a deep, guttural snarl, it turned, bounding away into the forest, its massive form vanishing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by ragged breathing and the rustling leaves. Jack forced himself onto his side, his vision swimming as he took in the scene. Mary lay a few feet away, her body trembling, her face streaked with dirt and pain. Blood seeped from her wounds, staining the moss beneath her. Footsteps approached, hurried, purposeful. A man emerged from the trees, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the scene before him. The hunter, drawn by the commotion, had arrived just in time. He knelt beside Mary first, assessing the damage, then turned to Jack. Jack and Mary's injuries were severe. They needed help immediately. A call was made, though Jack barely registered it. The world blurred in and out, the pain dulling into a distant sensation, something unreal. The wait for help felt endless, but eventually, the sound of helicopter blades cut through the stillness. A rescue team arrived, moving with swift efficiency, voices calm but urgent. Jack and Mary were lifted onto stretchers, their bodies battered, their minds reeling. The flight to the hospital was a blur of movement and noise. Jack faded in and out, the rhythmic hum of the aircraft blending with the pulsing pain in his leg. Mary, beside him, clung to consciousness, her breath shallow but steady. The hands of paramedics worked quickly, bandaging wounds, monitoring vitals, their faces focused and unreadable. By the time they reached the hospital, the worst had passed. Hours of surgery followed, stitches weaving across torn skin, medications dulling the worst of the pain. The injuries were grave but not fatal. Jack's leg, though deeply lacerated, would heal with time. Mary's shoulder and back bore the brutal marks of claws, but no vital organs had been damaged. They would recover. News of the attack spread quickly. Wildlife officials tracked the bear's movements, searching for signs of further aggression. But the grizzly had vanished, retreating deep into the wilderness, following the instinct that had driven its initial attack: fear, hunger, survival. For the Thompsons, the attack was more than a brush with death. It was a stark, violent reminder that the wilderness, no matter how familiar, was never truly tame. They had always respected the land, but now they understood its raw unpredictability in a way they had never understood before. Weeks passed, and wounds turned to scars. The pain dulled, though it never fully disappeared. Their days of foraging, of wandering freely through the woods, were now over. The desire remained, but the risk was too great. They still looked out at the trees from their back porch, still listened to the wind rustling through the pines, still felt the pull of the wild. But now, there was a distance between them and the land they had once roamed without fear. The forest had given them so much over the years: peace, adventure, purpose. And in one terrible moment, it had taken something in return.